Hey everyone. Tonight we're stepping into the shadowy halls of history to uncover the secrets of medieval castles, those towering stone giants that dominated Europe's landscape for centuries. These weren't just buildings, they were self-contained worlds, pulsing with defense, power, and daily life, all woven together with incredible purpose. Before we dive in, take a sec to like the video and subscribe if you're loving these journeys. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always awesome to see who's joining us from across the globe. Now, grab a cozy spot, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum, and let's embark on this adventure together. The medieval castle was, at its essence, a fortress home. It was the dwelling place of nobility, the administrative center of vast territories, and the ultimate expression of feudal power. These imposing structures rose from the landscape like permanent declarations of authority, their walls speaking of strength, their towers reaching toward the heavens as symbols of divine right and earthly dominion. Let us begin by understanding that the medieval castle was not built in a day, nor was it the product of a single mind. These structures evolved over centuries, each generation adding to the knowledge of their predecessors, each castle learning from the successes and failures of those that came before. The castle was a living entity, growing and changing as the needs of its inhabitants evolved and as the art of warfare advanced. The origins of the medieval castle can be traced back to the 9th and 10th centuries when the collapse of the Carolingian Empire left Europe fragmented and vulnerable. Local lords found themselves responsible for defending their own territories, and the castle became the cornerstone of this new feudal system. These early castles were often simple affairs, wooden structures built atop earthen mounds called mottes, surrounded by wooden palisades and ditches. The motte and bailey castle, as it came to be known, was the foundation upon which all later castle development would rest. The motte was an artificial hill, sometimes 30 feet high or more, crowned with a wooden tower called a keep. This keep served as the final refuge in times of siege, a place where the lord and his family could make their last stand if all other defenses failed. Below the motte lay the bailey, an enclosed courtyard where the daily business of the castle took place. The construction of these early earthwork castles was a massive undertaking that required the labor of hundreds of workers. Peasants would spend months moving earth with simple tools, basket by basket, creating the artificial hills that would support the wooden towers. The timber for these early structures came from carefully managed forests, each tree selected for its specific purpose in the castle's construction. Oak was preferred for its strength and durability, while other woods were chosen for their particular properties. The palisades that surrounded these early castles were not simple fences, but sophisticated defensive barriers. Each log was carefully shaped and fitted, creating a wall that could withstand considerable force. The tops of these palisades were often sharpened to points, creating a deadly barrier for anyone attempting to climb over. Gates were reinforced with iron bands and secured with massive wooden bars that required several men to lift. As the centuries passed, wood gave way to stone. The reasons for this transformation were manifold. Stone was more durable, more resistant to fire, and more capable of withstanding the increasingly sophisticated siege engines that medieval warfare produced. The transition from wood to stone was gradual, often taking place over decades as lords accumulated the resources necessary for such massive undertakings. The process of building a stone castle was an endeavor that could span generations. Quarries had to be located, stone had to be cut and transported, master masons had to be hired, and vast sums of money had to be allocated. A single castle might require the work of hundreds of craftsmen over the course of many years. The logistics alone were staggering, requiring careful coordination of resources, labor, and time. The selection of stone for castle construction was a matter of great importance. Different types of stone had different properties, and the master mason needed to understand these characteristics to create a structure that would endure. Limestone was favored for its workability and durability, while sandstone was chosen for its attractive appearance. Granite, though difficult to work, provided unmatched strength for the most critical structural elements. The transportation of stone from quarry to construction site was one of the greatest challenges facing medieval builders. Massive blocks of stone, some weighing several tons, had to be moved across miles of rough terrain, using only human and animal power. Special carts with massive wheels were constructed for this purpose, pulled by teams of oxen along roads that were often little more than dirt tracks. Rivers and streams were utilized whenever possible, with stone being loaded onto barges and floated to locations near the construction site. The great stone keeps that began to appear in the 11th and 12th centuries were marvels of engineering. These massive towers, some rising over 100 feet into the air, were designed to be impregnable. Their walls were often 15 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as they rose. The corners were rounded to deflect projectiles, and the few openings were carefully placed to provide maximum defensive advantage while minimizing vulnerability. The foundation of a stone castle was perhaps the most critical element of its construction. Master masons would dig deep into the earth, sometimes 20 feet or more, until they reached solid bedrock. The foundation stones were massive blocks, carefully fitted together without mortar in some cases, relying on their weight and precise cutting to create a stable base. These foundations had to support not only the enormous weight of the castle walls, but also the dynamic forces created by siege engines and earthquakes. The mortar used in castle construction was a carefully guarded secret, with each master mason having his own formula for creating the strongest possible bond between stones. Lime was the primary ingredient, burned in special kilns at high temperatures to create quicklime. This was then mixed with sand, water, and various additives such as crushed pottery, animal hair, or even blood, to create a mortar that would harden to stone-like strength. Within these keeps, life followed patterns that had been established over generations. The Great Hall was the heart of castle life, a vast space where meals were served, business was conducted, and entertainment was provided. The Lord's table sat upon a raised platform called a dais, emphasizing his elevated status over his vassals and servants. The walls were hung with tapestries that provided both decoration and insulation against the cold stone. The great hall was not merely a dining room, but the center of all castle life. Here, the Lord held court, dispensing justice and settling disputes. Here, important visitors were received and entertained. Here, the castle's inhabitants
gathered for meals, celebrations, and the simple human need for companionship. The hall was designed to impress, with soaring ceilings supported by massive wooden beams and windows that, while small by modern standards, allowed precious light to filter into the space.
The fireplace in the Great Hall was often a masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship. These enormous structures, sometimes large enough for a person to walk inside, were designed not only to provide heat, but to serve as symbols of the Lord's wealth and power. The chimney was a relatively late innovation, and early halls often suffered from smoky conditions as fires burned in central hearths with only holes in the roof to allow smoke to escape. The kitchen was typically located in a separate building or in the basement of the keep, connected to the Great Hall by a series of corridors and staircases. This separation served multiple purposes. It reduced the risk of fire, it kept the smells and heat of cooking away from the living areas, and it provided a measure of security by preventing potential poisoners from having easy access to the Lord's table. The castle kitchen was a world unto itself, a place of constant activity and carefully organized chaos. The head cook, often a person of considerable status within the castle hierarchy, presided over a staff of assistants, each with their own specialized roles. The kitchen staff included bakers, brewers, butchers, and scullery maids, all working together to feed the dozens or hundreds of people who lived within the castle walls. The great ovens of the castle kitchen were marvels of medieval engineering. Built into the thick walls of the castle, these ovens could maintain high temperatures for hours, allowing bakers to produce the vast quantities of bread required to feed the castle's inhabitants. The ovens were fired with wood in the early morning hours, and the heat was carefully managed throughout the day to accommodate different baking needs. Food preparation in a medieval castle was a complex operation that required careful planning and coordination. The castle's kitchens were equipped with massive cauldrons that could hold dozens of gallons of soup or stew. These cauldrons were suspended over fires by elaborate pulley systems that allowed cooks to raise and lower them as needed. The preparation of a single meal for the castle's inhabitants might require the use of multiple cauldrons, each containing different components of the meal. Storage was a constant concern, as castles needed to maintain supplies that could last through long sieges. The castle's larder was a marvel of medieval food preservation. Salted meats hung from hooks in cool, dry chambers. Grains were stored in great barrels and sacks, carefully protected from moisture and vermin. Root vegetables were kept in cellars dug deep into the earth, where the temperature remained constant throughout the year. These food stores were not merely conveniences, but essential elements of the castle's defensive strategy. The preservation of meat was accomplished through various methods, each suited to different types of meat and different storage conditions. Salting was the most common method, with meat being packed in coarse salt for weeks or months. Smoking was another popular technique, with special smokehouses built to cure meat over smoldering fires. Some meats were preserved in fat, completely covered with rendered lard or other fats to exclude air and prevent spoilage. The castle's brewhouse was another essential facility, as ale and beer were the primary beverages for most castle inhabitants. Water was often unsafe to drink, and the brewing process helped to purify it, while creating a nutritious and mildly alcoholic beverage that could be stored for months. The brewing process required specialized equipment and considerable skill,
with the castle's brewer being an important member of the household staff. The malting process began with soaking barley in water until it began to sprout, then drying it over fires to stop the germination process. The dried malt was then ground and mixed with hot water to create a sweet liquid called wort. Hops or other herbs were added for flavor and preservation, and yeast was introduced to begin the fermentation process. The entire process, from grain to finished ale, could take several weeks and required constant attention from skilled brewers. Water was perhaps the most critical resource of all. A castle without a reliable water source was a castle that could not withstand a siege. Some castles were fortunate enough to be built near natural springs or streams, but many had to rely on wells dug deep into the earth. These wells were often located within the keep itself, ensuring that the defenders would have access to fresh water, even if the outer defenses fell.
The construction of a castle well was a feat of engineering that required careful planning and skilled labor. The well shaft had to be dug straight down through solid rock, often to depths of 100 feet or more. The walls of the shaft were lined with stone to prevent collapse, and elaborate pulley systems were constructed to raise and lower the heavy buckets used to draw water. The work was dangerous, with diggers working in cramped conditions far below ground, always at risk from cave-ins or poisonous gases. Some castles were equipped with elaborate cistern systems that collected and stored rainwater. These cisterns were carefully designed to filter and purify the water as it flowed through layers of sand and gravel. The cisterns themselves were lined with lead or clay to prevent contamination, and they were covered to prevent the growth of algae and the breeding of insects. The castle's defenses extended far beyond its walls. The approach to a castle was carefully designed to give every advantage to the defenders and every disadvantage to attackers. The road leading to the castle often zigzagged back and forth, forcing approaching armies to expose their flanks to defensive fire. Ditches and earthworks channeled attackers into predetermined killing zones where archers and crossbowmen could rain down death from above. The outer defenses of a castle often included a series of earthworks and obstacles designed to slow and confuse attackers. These might include ditches filled with sharpened stakes, earthen ramparts topped with wooden palisades, and carefully placed obstacles that would force attackers to bunch together in vulnerable groups. Some castles were surrounded by water-filled moats, while others relied on dry ditches that were too wide and deep for attackers to cross easily. The gatehouse was perhaps the most formidable element of castle defense. This was not merely a doorway, but a complex defensive structure that could stop an attacking army in its tracks. The typical gatehouse featured multiple sets of gates, each more formidable than the last. The outer gate was often a massive wooden structure reinforced with iron bands and studded with iron spikes. Behind this lay the portcullis, a heavy iron grating that could be dropped at a moment's notice to seal the entrance. The portcullis was a masterpiece of medieval engineering, consisting of a heavy iron or wooden grating that moved up and down in vertical grooves cut into the stone walls of the gatehouse. The mechanism for raising and lowering the portcullis was typically located in a chamber above the gate passage where defenders could operate it even while under attack. The portcullis could be dropped in seconds, trapping attackers who had breached the outer gate. Between the outer gate and the portcullis lay a chamber called the barbican, where attackers who had breached the first line of defense found themselves trapped in a stone box with murder holes in the ceiling through which boiling oil, molten lead, or simple stones could be poured down upon them.
Arrow loops in the walls allowed defenders to shoot at close range while remaining protected behind thick stone walls. The murder holes themselves were carefully designed openings in the ceiling of the gate passage. These holes allowed defenders to drop various projectiles on attackers below, but they were small enough to prevent attackers from shooting up through them effectively. The defenders above could pour boiling water, heated sand, or molten metal through these holes, creating a deadly rain that would stop even the most determined assault. The walls themselves were marvels of defensive engineering. They were not simply high barriers, but complex systems designed to maximize the defender's advantages. The base of the wall was often built with a pronounced slope called a batter, which made it difficult for attackers to place scaling ladders and caused dropped stones to bounce outward into the ranks of besiegers. The top of the wall featured battlements, alternating high and low sections that allowed defenders to shoot through the gaps while taking cover behind the raised portions. The construction of castle walls required careful attention to both structural integrity and defensive effectiveness. The walls were typically built with two outer faces of dressed stone filled with rubble and mortar. This construction method, known as ashlar facing with rubble core, provided strength while conserving the expensive dressed stone for the most visible portions of the wall. The rubble core also helped to absorb the impact of siege engines, distributing the force of blows across a wider area.
Towers punctuated the walls at regular intervals, providing flanking fire that could sweep the length of the wall and eliminate blind spots where attackers might gather. These towers were often built as independent defensive positions, capable of holding out even if the wall itself was breached. Each tower was typically equipped with its own water supply, food stores, and sleeping quarters, allowing a small garrison to maintain resistance for weeks or even months. The spacing of towers along a castle wall was determined by the range of the defensive weapons available to the castle's garrison. Crossbows and longbows had effective ranges of several hundred yards, so towers were typically placed no more than 2 bowshots apart. This ensured that defenders in one tower could provide supporting fire for defenders in adjacent towers, creating overlapping fields of fire that made it nearly impossible for attackers to find safe positions along the wall. The design of individual towers varied considerably depending on their specific function and the period in which they were built. Round towers became increasingly popular over time because they were stronger than square towers and provided no corners where siege engines could concentrate their attacks. The walls of round towers were often built with a pronounced batter at the base, making them extremely difficult to undermine or batter down. The art of siege warfare evolved alongside castle construction, creating an endless cycle of innovation and counter-innovation. As castles became stronger, siege engines became more powerful. The trebuchet, a massive catapult that could hurl stones weighing several hundred pounds, could batter down walls that had previously been thought impregnable. In response, castle builders developed new techniques, such as building walls with rubble cores that could absorb the impact of projectiles without cracking. The trebuchet represented the pinnacle of medieval siege technology. These massive machines, some standing over 40 feet tall, used counterweights weighing several tons to hurl projectiles with tremendous force and accuracy. The construction of a trebuchet required skilled engineers and considerable time, but once completed, these machines could breach walls that had withstood conventional attacks for months. Mining was another siege technique that forced castle builders to adapt their designs. Attackers would tunnel beneath the walls, supporting the excavation with wooden props. When the tunnel was complete, the props would be burned, causing the tunnel to collapse and taking a section of wall with it. Castle builders responded by constructing their walls on solid rock foundations where possible,
or by building walls so thick that mining them would be impractical. Countermining became a defensive technique used by castle garrisons to defeat enemy mining operations. Defenders would dig their own tunnels to intercept enemy mines, leading to underground battles fought in cramped, dangerous conditions. Some castles were equipped with listening posts, where defenders could detect the sounds of enemy digging and locate their tunnels. Wells and deep foundations also served as early warning systems, as changes in water level or the discovery of enemy tunnels could alert defenders to mining operations. The daily life within a castle was governed by routines that had been established over centuries. The castle day began before dawn, with the ringing of bells that called the inhabitants to their morning prayers. The lord and his family would attend mass in the castle chapel, while the servants began their daily tasks. The great hall would be cleared of the trestle tables where the lower-ranking inhabitants had slept, and preparations would begin for the day's meals. The castle's bell tower served as more than just a call to worship. The bells marked the canonical hours that structured medieval life, calling the faithful to prayer at specific times throughout the day and night. The bells also served as an alarm system, with different patterns of ringing, indicating different types of danger. The person responsible for ringing the bells held an important position in the castle hierarchy, as their vigilance could mean the difference between life and death for the castle's inhabitants.
The morning routine in a castle was a carefully orchestrated series of activities that ensured the smooth functioning of the entire community. Servants would rise before dawn to light fires, clean the great hall, and begin preparing the morning meal. The kitchen staff would begin baking bread for the day, while the stable hands would tend to the horses and other animals. The castle's guards would change shifts, with the night watch being relieved by the day watch. The castle's economy was largely self-sufficient, producing most of what it needed within its own walls or on the surrounding lands. The castle's workshops produced everything from horseshoes to tapestries, from weapons to household utensils. Skilled craftsmen lived within the castle walls, their trades passed down from father to son through generations. The blacksmith's forge glowed day and night, producing the iron tools and weapons that the castle needed to function. The blacksmith's workshop was one of the most important facilities in any castle. Here, iron was shaped into everything from horseshoes and nails to swords and armor. The blacksmith needed to understand the properties of different types of iron and steel, knowing how to heat, shape, and temper metal to create tools and weapons of the highest quality. The forge itself was a carefully constructed facility, with bellows to increase the heat of the fire and anvils of different sizes for different types of work. The castle's carpenter shop was another essential facility, producing everything from furniture to siege engines. Medieval carpenters were highly skilled craftsmen who understood the properties of different types of wood and knew how to join pieces together to create strong, durable structures. The carpenter's tools were precious possessions, often passed down through generations of craftsmen. The workshop itself was filled with the sweet smell of wood shavings and the sound of planes, saws, and hammers. The castle's agricultural activities extended far beyond its walls. The lord's domain, the land directly controlled by the castle, might encompass thousands of acres. This land was worked by peasants who lived in villages scattered throughout the territory. These peasants owed various obligations to their lord, including labor service, military service, and payments in kind. The relationship between lord and peasant was complex, involving mutual obligations and responsibilities that defined the structure of medieval society. The management of the castle's agricultural lands required careful planning and coordination. The lord's reeve, an official responsible for overseeing agricultural activities, would determine when fields should be planted, when crops should be harvested, and how the harvest should be distributed. The three-field system was commonly used, with one field planted with winter crops, one with spring crops, and one left fallow to restore its fertility. The castle's mills were essential facilities that processed grain into flour for bread making. Water mills were preferred where streams were available, as they could operate continuously without human or animal power. Windmills were used in areas where water power was not available, though they were dependent on weather conditions. The lord typically owned all mills in his territory and required peasants to use them for a fee, making the mills important sources of revenue. The castle served as the administrative center for this vast rural economy. The lord's reeve, an official responsible for keeping careful records of all transactions, recording the amounts of grain harvested, the number of animals raised, and the various payments and services owed by the peasants. These records were kept on parchment rolls that were stored in the castle's archives, creating a detailed picture of medieval rural life that historians still study today. The castle's scriptorium was where these important records were created and maintained. Monks or educated clerks would spend hours carefully writing on parchment with quill pens, creating documents that recorded everything from tax obligations to legal judgments. The art of writing was a specialized skill in medieval times, and those who possessed it held positions of considerable importance within the castle hierarchy.
Justice was another important function of the castle. The lord held court in the great hall, hearing disputes between his vassals and tenants. These courts followed ancient customs and traditions, dispensing justice according to laws that had been passed down through generations. The lord's authority to judge and punish was one of the most important aspects of feudal power, and the castle served as the symbol of that authority. The administration of justice in a medieval castle was a complex process that balanced ancient customs with practical necessities. Different types of courts handled different types of cases, from simple disputes over property boundaries to serious crimes like theft and murder. The lord's court was the highest authority within his territory, but he was also bound by custom and tradition in his judgments. The castle's prison was typically located in the basement of the keep, or in a tower specifically designed for that purpose. These dungeons were dark, damp places where prisoners were held while awaiting trial or serving their sentences. Conditions were harsh, and prisoners were dependent on their families or friends to provide food and other necessities. The dungeon served not only as a place of punishment, but as a deterrent to others who might consider breaking the law. The castle's military function was never far from the minds of its inhabitants. Even in times of peace, the castle maintained a garrison of professional soldiers who trained regularly and kept their weapons and armor in constant readiness. These soldiers were supported by a complex logistical system that ensured they had everything they needed to defend the castle and its surrounding territory. The organization of the castle's military forces was based on a careful balance of different types of soldiers, each with their own specialized roles. Knights formed the elite heavy cavalry, trained from childhood in the arts of war and equipped with the finest armor and weapons. Men-at-arms served as professional infantry, skilled in the use of various weapons and capable of fighting on foot or on horseback. Archers and crossbowmen provided ranged support, their skills essential for defending the castle walls. The training of castle soldiers was a constant activity that required careful supervision and considerable resources. Knights practiced their horsemanship and weapon skills daily, participating in tournaments and mock battles that honed their abilities. Men-at-arms drilled with their weapons and practiced formation fighting, learning to work together as disciplined units. Archers spent hours each day shooting at targets, developing the accuracy and strength needed to be effective in battle. The castle's armory was a carefully organized storehouse of weapons and armor. Swords, spears, crossbows, and arrows were stored in racks along the walls, each weapon cleaned and oiled to prevent rust. Suits of armor hung from wooden stands, ready to be donned at a moment's notice. The armorer was a skilled craftsman who maintained these weapons and produced new ones as needed. His workshop filled with the tools of his trade and the constant sound of hammering metal. The production of medieval armor was a complex process that required considerable skill and specialized tools. Each piece of armor had to be carefully shaped to fit the individual who would wear it, and the various pieces had to work together to provide maximum protection while allowing freedom of movement. The armorer needed to understand the properties of different types of metal and know how to heat, shape, and temper them to create armor that would turn aside sword blows and arrow strikes. The castle's stables were another essential facility, housing the horses that were vital to medieval warfare and transportation. The care of these animals required specialized knowledge and considerable resources. Each horse needed daily grooming, exercise, and feeding, and the stable staff needed to be skilled in treating injuries and illnesses. The quality of a castle's horses was often a measure of its lord's wealth and military capability.
The breeding and training of war horses was a specialized activity that required years of patient work. These animals needed to be strong enough to carry a fully armored knight into battle, brave enough to charge into combat, and intelligent enough to respond to their rider's commands in the chaos of battle. The best war horses were extremely valuable, worth more than a peasant family might earn in several years. Training was a constant activity within the castle walls. The courtyard echoed with the clash of swords as knights and men-at-arms practiced their skills. Archery butts were set up against the walls, where bowmen honed their accuracy. The castle's master-at-arms oversaw these training sessions, ensuring that every man knew his role in the castle's defense and could perform it effectively when called upon. The master-at-arms was typically a veteran soldier who had proven his skills in battle and earned the respect of his men. He was responsible not only for training the castle's garrison, but also for maintaining discipline and ensuring that the castle's defenses were always ready.
The master-at-arms worked closely with the castle's constable, who was responsible for the overall military organization of the castle. The castle's communications network was as important as its physical defenses. Messengers carried news and orders between the castle and its outlying territories, while beacon fires on distant hilltops could send signals across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. The castle's lord needed to stay informed about developments throughout his domain, and the speed of communication could mean the difference between victory and defeat in times of conflict. The system of beacon fires was a sophisticated communication network that allowed information to be transmitted across vast distances in a very short time. Each beacon was located on a high hill or tower where it could be seen from a great distance. The keepers of each beacon were responsible for maintaining fires that could be lit at a moment's notice, and they needed to understand the complex system of signals that could convey different types of information. Messenger services were another critical component of the castle's communication system. These men needed to be skilled riders who could travel quickly and safely across dangerous terrain. They carried important letters and documents in sealed pouches, and they were often given passwords or other forms of identification to ensure that their messages reached the intended recipients. The life of a messenger was dangerous, as they were valuable targets for enemies who wanted to intercept important communications. The relationship between the castle and the surrounding countryside was one of mutual dependence. The castle provided protection and justice for the peasants who worked the land, while the peasants provided the food and labor that allowed the castle to function. This relationship was formalized through a complex system of obligations and privileges that defined the structure of feudal society. The castle's protection extended beyond its walls to encompass the entire territory under the lord's control. In times of danger, peasants from outlying villages could seek refuge within the castle walls, bringing their most valuable possessions and livestock with them. The castle's outer bailey was often designed to accommodate these refugees, with temporary shelters and facilities for their animals. Markets were held regularly in the castle's outer courtyard or in nearby towns, where peasants could sell their surplus produce and purchase goods they could not make themselves. These markets were carefully regulated by the lord's officials, who collected taxes and fees on all transactions. The market day was a social occasion as well as an economic one, bringing together people from across the territory to exchange news and gossip along with goods and services. The regulation of markets was an important source of revenue for the castle lord. Merchants had to pay fees for the right to set up stalls, and all transactions were subject to taxes. The lord's officials ensured that weights and measures were accurate and that goods were of acceptable quality. Disputes between merchants and customers were settled by the lord's court, with fines and penalties providing additional revenue.
The castle's chapel was more than just a place of worship. It was the spiritual heart of the entire community. The castle's priest, often a man of considerable learning, provided not only religious services, but also education for the lord's children and record-keeping services for the castle's administration. The chapel's library, though small by modern standards, was often the only collection of books for miles around, containing not only religious texts, but also works on law, medicine, and other practical subjects. The role of the castle priest extended far beyond conducting religious services. He served as confessor to the Lord and his family, providing spiritual guidance and counsel. He often acted as the castle's secretary, using his literacy to maintain records and correspond with other religious houses and secular authorities. The priest's education made him a valuable advisor on legal and administrative matters. The castle's library was a precious resource in an age when books were rare and expensive. Each book was copied by hand on parchment or vellum, a process that could take months or even years to complete. The books were stored in chests or on shelves in the chapel, protected from moisture and pests that could damage the delicate parchment. The collection might include religious texts, legal codes, medical treatises, and works of literature. The education of the Lord's children was a matter of great importance, as they would one day inherit the responsibility of governing the territory. Young nobles learned to read and write in Latin, the language of the church and of scholarship. They studied arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, subjects that were considered essential for a well-educated nobleman. They also received instruction in history, law, and rhetoric, skills that would serve them well in their future roles as leaders and administrators. The physical education of noble children was equally important. Boys learned to ride horses almost before they could walk, developing the skills they would need as knights. They practiced with wooden swords and shields, learning the basic techniques of combat. As they grew older, they would be sent to other castles to serve as pages and squires, completing their education under the guidance of experienced knights. The education of noble girls followed a different path, but was no less important. They learned to read and write, though often in their native language rather than Latin. They studied music, dancing, and needlework, skills that were considered essential for a lady of noble birth. They also learned the complex arts of household management, as they would one day be responsible for running their own castles. The castle's great hall was the stage for elaborate ceremonies and festivals that marked the passage of the seasons and celebrated important events. The Christmas feast was perhaps the most important of these celebrations, lasting for 12 days and featuring elaborate meals, entertainment, and the exchange of gifts. The great hall would be decorated with holly and other evergreens, and the Yule log would burn in the great fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the tapestried walls. The Christmas celebration in a medieval castle was a time of joy and fellowship that brought together all members of the castle community. The Lord would distribute gifts to his vassals and servants, reinforcing the bonds of loyalty that held the feudal system together. Special foods were prepared for the occasion, including roasted meats, sweetbreads, and spiced wines that were reserved for the most important celebrations. The Easter celebration was another important event in the castle's calendar. The chapel would be decorated with flowers and candles, and special masses would be held to commemorate the resurrection of Christ. The Easter feast featured foods that had been forbidden during the Lent season, and the castle's inhabitants would celebrate the end of winter and the beginning of spring.
Music and entertainment were important aspects of castle life. Traveling minstrels brought news and songs from distant lands, while the castle's own musicians provided accompaniment for meals and celebrations. The Lord's Hall resonated with the sounds of lutes,
drums and voices raised in song, creating an atmosphere of warmth and conviviality that helped to strengthen the bonds between lord and vassal. The minstrels who visited medieval castles were more than mere entertainers. They served as news carriers, bringing information about events in distant lands. Their songs often contained important historical and political information, passed down through oral tradition from generation to generation. The minstrels were skilled performers who could adapt their repertoire to suit their audience, providing both entertainment and education. The castle's own musicians were permanent members of the household, responsible for providing music for religious services, meals, and celebrations. These musicians were skilled performers who could play a variety of instruments and sing in multiple voices. They often composed their own music, creating songs that celebrated the achievements of their lord or commemorated important events in the castle's history. Dancing was another important form of entertainment in medieval castles. The great hall would be cleared of tables and benches, and the castle's inhabitants would participate in elaborate dances that followed ancient traditions. These dances served not only as entertainment, but as social rituals that reinforced the hierarchical structure of castle society. The castle's defense was not merely a matter of walls and weapons, but also of diplomacy and alliance. The lord needed to maintain good relations with his neighbors, balancing the competing demands of loyalty to his overlord and protection of his own interests. Marriage alliances were carefully negotiated to strengthen political ties, while treaties and agreements helped to prevent conflicts that might threaten the castle's security. The art of medieval diplomacy was complex and subtle, requiring great skill and careful judgment. Ambassadors and envoys traveled between castles, carrying messages and negotiating agreements. These diplomatic missions were often dangerous, as they might take place during times of tension or conflict. The safety of diplomatic messengers was generally respected, but there were no guarantees in the dangerous world of medieval politics. Marriage alliances were one of the most important tools of medieval diplomacy. Noble families carefully arranged marriages between their children to strengthen political ties and secure military alliances. These marriages were rarely based on romantic love, but instead were calculated political decisions designed to advance the interests of both families. The wedding celebrations themselves were elaborate affairs that demonstrated the wealth and power of the families involved. The negotiation of treaties and agreements required great skill and patience. Medieval lords needed to balance their own interests with those of their allies and overlords, creating agreements that would provide security without compromising their independence. These negotiations often took place over months or even years, with careful attention paid to every detail of the final agreement. The castle's economy extended beyond agriculture to include trade and commerce. The lord's merchants traveled to distant markets, buying and selling goods that could not be produced locally. These trading ventures were risky but potentially profitable, bringing exotic goods and new ideas to the castle while generating the wealth needed to maintain its defenses and support its inhabitants. Medieval trade was a dangerous but essential activity that connected castles to the wider world.
Merchants traveled along established trade routes, carrying goods from one region to another. These routes were often dangerous, passing through territories controlled by hostile lords or infested with bandits who preyed upon unwary travelers. The protection of merchant caravans was often arranged through agreements between lords who charged fees for safe passage through their territories.
The goods that flowed through medieval trade networks were diverse and valuable. Spices from the East brought flavors that could transform the simplest meal into a feast fit for nobility. Silks and fine fabrics from distant lands adorned the bodies of the wealthy, while precious metals and gems served as symbols of power and status. Salt, essential for preserving food, was so valuable that it was sometimes used as currency. Iron and steel, necessary for weapons and tools, moved along trade routes that connected regions rich in ore with those skilled in metalworking. The castle's role in this trade network was both protective and extractive. The lord provided security for merchants passing through his territory, but he also collected tolls and taxes that could significantly increase the cost of goods. These fees were justified as payment for protection, but they also served as important sources of revenue for the castle. The balance between encouraging trade and extracting maximum profit required careful judgment, as excessive fees could drive merchants to seek alternative routes. The castle's construction techniques were passed down through generations of master builders, each adding their own innovations to the accumulated knowledge of centuries. The use of different types of stone, the design of arches and vaults, the engineering of complex water systems, all of these skills were refined and perfected over time, creating structures that could withstand both the test of time and the assault of enemies. The guild system played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting construction knowledge. Master masons belonged to exclusive guilds that closely guarded their secrets, passing them down only to carefully selected apprentices. These guilds maintained standards of craftsmanship and controlled access to the profession, ensuring that only skilled and trustworthy individuals could work on important projects like castle construction. The apprenticeship system was the foundation of medieval craftsmanship. Young boys, often as young as 7 or 8 years old, would be sent to live with master craftsmen for periods of 7 to 10 years. During this time, they would learn not only the technical skills of their trade, but also the moral and ethical standards expected of guild members. The relationship between master and apprentice was often like that between father and son, with the master taking responsibility for the apprentice's moral as well as technical education. The tools used in castle construction were simple by modern standards, but remarkably effective in skilled hands. Stonemasons used hammers, chisels, and measuring devices that had changed little over centuries. The quality of these tools was crucial to the success of any construction project, and master craftsmen often made their own tools or had them made by skilled blacksmiths to their exact specifications. The spiritual life of the castle was centered around the rhythm of the church calendar, with its cycle of feasts and fasts, celebrations and penances. The castle's inhabitants marked the passage of time not by the modern calendar, but by the feast days of saints and the seasons of the liturgical year. Each day began and ended with prayer, and the ringing of church bells marked the canonical hours throughout the day and night. These hours were observed not only by clergy, but by all members of the castle community, creating a rhythm of life that was both spiritual and practical. The castle's role in the broader feudal system was complex and multifaceted. It served as a link in the chain of authority that stretched from the king down to the humblest peasant,
each level owing obligations to those above and receiving protection and privileges from those below. The castle was both a symbol of this system and a practical instrument for its implementation.
The feudal oath was the foundation of this system, creating bonds of loyalty and obligation that held medieval society together. These oaths were taken in elaborate ceremonies that emphasized the sacred nature of the relationship between lord and vassal. The breaking of a feudal oath was considered one of the most serious crimes in medieval society, punishable by loss of lands, titles, and even life. The maintenance of a castle was a never-ending task that required constant attention and considerable resources. Stone walls needed to be repaired and repointed, wooden structures required replacement, and metal fittings had to be maintained against the constant threat of rust and decay. The castle's master of works oversaw these maintenance activities, ensuring that the fortress remained in good repair and ready to fulfill its defensive function. The master of works was a skilled professional who understood all aspects of castle construction and maintenance. He supervised teams of craftsmen and laborers, allocated resources, and ensured that work was completed to the highest standards. His responsibilities extended beyond simple maintenance to include improvements and modifications that would enhance the castle's defensive capabilities or living conditions. The seasonal cycle of maintenance work reflected the practical realities of medieval life. Spring was the time for major repairs and improvements, when the weather was favorable and materials were readily available. Summer construction work could continue at a rapid pace, with long daylight hours allowing maximum productivity. Autumn was the time for completing projects and preparing the castle for the harsh winter months, when outdoor work would be difficult or impossible. The castle's water systems were marvels of medieval engineering that required careful maintenance and operation. Wells had to be kept clean and functional, cisterns needed to be maintained and refilled, and drainage systems required regular cleaning to prevent flooding. The castle's water supply was literally a matter of life and death, and great care was taken to ensure its reliability and purity. The maintenance of castle wells was a specialized task that required both courage and skill. Workers had to descend into the deep, narrow shafts to clean debris and repair stone linings. This work was dangerous, as the workers risked being overcome by poisonous gases or crushed by falling stones. The importance of this work meant that well-maintenance specialists were highly valued members of the castle community. Drainage systems within castles were sophisticated networks of channels and pipes that carried wastewater and sewage away from living areas. These systems required regular cleaning and maintenance to prevent blockages that could cause serious health problems. The castle's sanitation systems, while primitive by modern standards, were remarkably advanced for their time and played a crucial role in maintaining the health of the castle's inhabitants. The castle's gardens provided fresh vegetables and herbs for the kitchen, as well as medicinal plants for the castle's infirmary. These gardens were carefully tended by skilled gardeners who understood the needs of different plants and the techniques needed to coax the best yields from often challenging soil conditions. The castle's orchards provided fruit that could be eaten fresh in season or preserved for the winter months. The art of medieval gardening was highly developed with techniques that had been refined over centuries. Gardeners understood the importance of crop rotation, companion planting, and natural pest control methods. They knew which plants grew well together and which should be kept apart, and they understood how to use natural fertilizers to maintain soil fertility. The castle's herb garden was particularly important, as it provided the raw materials for medicines and seasonings. Medieval gardeners cultivated dozens of different herbs, each with its own specific uses and growing requirements. Sage, thyme, rosemary, and other culinary herbs were grown alongside medicinal plants like chamomile, feverfew, and willow bark. The preservation of garden produce was essential for providing fresh food during the winter months. Vegetables were dried, pickled, or stored in root cellars where they could remain fresh for months. Fruits were made into preserves or dried for later use. The castle's still room was where many of these preservation activities took place, with skilled workers preparing foods according to traditional methods passed down through generations. The castle's relationship with the church was complex and multifaceted. While the Lord was the temporal authority within his domain, the church claimed spiritual authority over all Christians. This sometimes led to conflicts between secular and religious power, but more often resulted in a partnership that benefited both institutions. The castle provided protection for the church's property and personnel, while the church provided legitimacy and moral authority for the Lord's rule. The relationship between castle and monastery was particularly important in medieval society. Monasteries were centers of learning and culture, preserving ancient texts and developing new technologies. Many castles maintained close relationships with nearby monasteries, exchanging protection for spiritual services and scholarly expertise. Monks often served as advisors to castle lords, providing counsel on matters ranging from agriculture to diplomacy. The tithe system created a direct economic link between castle and church. Peasants were required to give 1/10 of their produce to the church, and castle lords often had the right to collect these tithes on behalf of religious institutions. This system provided steady income for the church while giving castle lords additional revenue and influence over religious affairs. The castle's role in the administration of justice extended beyond the Lord's court to include the complex system of customary law that governed medieval society. Different groups within the castle's territory might be subject to different legal traditions, and the Lord's officials needed to understand and apply these various legal systems fairly and consistently. The castle's archives contained not only administrative records, but also legal precedents and customary law codes that guided the administration of justice. The development of medieval law was a gradual process that combined ancient customs with new legislation and court decisions. Castle lords played an important role in this development, as their courts were often the places where new legal principles were established and tested. The decisions made in castle courts could influence legal development across entire regions, as successful precedents were adopted by other lords. The castle's prison system was an important component of its judicial function. Different types of prisoners were held in different conditions depending on their social status and the nature of their crimes. Noble prisoners were often held in relatively comfortable conditions, even being allowed to retain their servants. Common criminals faced much harsher treatment, often being confined in dark, cramped dungeons with minimal food and no comforts. The castle's military organization was based on a careful balance of professional soldiers and feudal levies. The core garrison consisted of knights and men-at-arms who lived within the castle walls and were available for immediate deployment.
In times of crisis, this professional force could be augmented by feudal levies, peasants and townsmen who owed military service to their lord in exchange for their land holdings. The training and equipment of feudal levies varied considerably depending on their social status and economic circumstances. Wealthy peasants might be able to afford good weapons and armor, while poorer individuals might have only simple spears and leather protection. The castle's military leaders needed to understand these limitations and organize their forces accordingly, using each type of soldier to best advantage.
The logistics of maintaining a military force were complex and demanding. Soldiers needed to be fed, equipped, and housed, and their weapons and armor required constant maintenance. The castle's armorer worked closely with the military commanders to ensure that all equipment was kept in good repair and that new weapons were produced as needed. The castle's storerooms contained not only food supplies, but also spare weapons, armor pieces, and the raw materials needed for repairs. The castle's communication systems extended far beyond simple messages and beacon fires. The lord needed to stay informed about political developments throughout the realm, and this required a network of informants and correspondents who could provide timely intelligence about potential threats and opportunities. The castle's secretary was often responsible for maintaining this correspondence, encoding sensitive information, and ensuring that important messages reached their intended recipients. The development of codes and ciphers was an important aspect of medieval communication. Sensitive information needed to be protected by interception by enemies, and various methods were developed to encode messages. Some codes used simple letter substitutions, while others employed more complex systems based on predetermined codebooks. The ability to create and break codes was a valuable skill that could provide significant advantages in diplomatic and military affairs. The castle's intelligence network often extended far beyond its own territory. Merchants, pilgrims, and other travelers were valuable sources of information about conditions in distant lands. The castle's lord might maintain agents in important cities or courts who would send regular reports about political developments that could affect his interests. This intelligence gathering was essential for making informed decisions about alliances, trade agreements, and military preparations. The castle's economic activities were carefully regulated to ensure maximum efficiency and profitability. The lord's bailiff oversaw the collection of rents and fees, the management of agricultural activities, and the operation of mills, forges, and other enterprises. These economic activities generated the wealth that allowed the castle to maintain its defenses and support its inhabitants, making economic management as important as military preparedness. The accounting systems used in medieval castles were surprisingly sophisticated, with detailed records kept of all income and expenditure. These records were maintained on parchment rolls that were stored in the castle's treasury, creating a comprehensive picture of the castle's economic activities. The ability to read and understand these records was a valuable skill, and castle stewards were often among the most educated members of the household. The castle's treasury was a secure facility where valuable items were stored and protected. This might include not only gold and silver coins, but also precious objects, important documents, and ceremonial items. The treasury was typically located in the most secure part of the castle,
often in the basement of the keep, and access was strictly controlled by trusted officials. The management of the castle's finances required careful planning and budgeting. Income from rents, taxes, and trade needed to be balanced against expenses for food, wages, maintenance, and military preparations. The castle's financial officers needed to understand seasonal variations in income and plan accordingly, ensuring that sufficient resources were available during lean periods. The castle's social hierarchy was complex and carefully maintained. The lord and his family occupied the highest level, followed by knights and other nobles, then professional soldiers and skilled craftsmen, and finally peasants and servants. Each level had its own privileges and responsibilities, and the smooth functioning of the castle depended on everyone understanding and fulfilling their role within this hierarchy. The ceremonies and rituals that maintained this social hierarchy were elaborate and carefully observed. The seating arrangements at meals, the order of precedence in processions, and the distribution of honors and rewards all served to reinforce the established social order. These rituals were not merely empty formalities, but important mechanisms for maintaining social stability and cohesion.
The castle's cultural life was enriched by the presence of scholars, artists, and craftsmen who created works of lasting beauty and significance. The castle's scriptorium produced illuminated manuscripts that were works of art as much as repositories of knowledge. The castle's workshops created tapestries, metalwork, and other decorative objects that demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of their patrons. The patronage system was crucial to the development of medieval art and culture. Castle lords supported artists and scholars not only for their own enjoyment, but also as displays of their wealth and power. The quality of the art and scholarship associated with the castle was often seen as a reflection of its lord's status and importance. The castle's library was more than just a collection of books. It was a center of learning and intellectual activity. Scholars came from great distances to consult rare texts, and the castle's own scholars engaged in copying, translating, and commenting on important works. The library served as a link between the castle and the broader intellectual community of medieval Europe. The preservation of knowledge was one of the most important functions of castle libraries. In an age when books were rare and fragile, the loss of a single manuscript could mean the disappearance of important knowledge. Castle librarians took great care to protect their collections from fire, water, and other threats, while also ensuring that important texts were copied to preserve them for future generations. The castle's medical facilities were primitive by modern standards, but represented the best available care in medieval times. The castle's infirmary was staffed by monks or lay brothers who had received training in herbal medicine and basic surgery. The castle's herb garden provided the raw materials for medicines, while the infirmary's small library contained medical texts that guided treatment decisions. Medieval medicine combined ancient knowledge with practical experience gained through centuries of treating illness and injury. Castle physicians understood the properties of various herbs and knew how to prepare medicines from natural ingredients. They could set broken bones, treat wounds, and perform simple surgical procedures, though their success rates were limited by the lack of understanding about infection and disease transmission. The castle's hospital facilities served not only the castle's own inhabitants, but also travelers and pilgrims who fell ill while passing through the territory. The provision of medical care was seen as both a Christian duty and a practical necessity.
as disease could spread rapidly through confined populations. The castle's medical staff worked to prevent outbreaks of plague and other contagious diseases through quarantine measures and sanitation practices. The changing seasons brought different challenges and opportunities to castle life. Summer was the time for military campaigns and major construction projects, when the weather was good and travel was relatively easy. Winter was a time for indoor activities, when the castle's inhabitants gathered around the great fireplace to share stories and pass the long, dark nights. Spring brought renewal and hope, as the castle's gardens came back to life and the cycle of agricultural activity began anew. The seasonal rhythm of castle life was closely tied to the agricultural calendar that dominated medieval society. The harvest season was a time of intense activity, as crops needed to be gathered quickly before they spoiled or were damaged by weather. The castle's entire population might be mobilized for harvest work, with even nobles and clergy participating in the effort to bring in the crops that would sustain the community through the winter. The winter months were a time of relative quiet within the castle walls. With outdoor work limited by cold and darkness, the castle's inhabitants turned to indoor activities like crafts, storytelling, and religious observance. The long winter evenings were often spent in the Great Hall, where the entire community would gather around the fire to share meals, listen to music, and enjoy each other's company. The celebration of seasonal festivals helped to mark the passage of time and provide relief from the routine of daily life. The spring festivals celebrated the renewal of life and the beginning of the agricultural season. Summer festivals marked the longest days of the year and the abundance of the growing season. Autumn festivals gave thanks for the harvest and prepared the community for the coming winter. Winter festivals, culminating in the Christmas celebration, brought light and joy to the darkest time of the year. The castle's role in the development of medieval technology cannot be overstated. The need to defend these structures led to innovations in metallurgy, engineering, and architecture that had far-reaching effects on medieval society. The castle's workshops were centers of technological innovation, where craftsmen experimented with new techniques and materials in their quest to create better weapons, stronger walls, and more efficient mechanical devices.
The development of mechanical devices within castle walls included everything from simple pulleys and levers to complex clockwork mechanisms. Castle builders were among the first to use mechanical clocks to regulate daily activities, and these early timepieces were marvels of medieval engineering. Watermills and windmills were adapted for use within castle compounds, providing power for grinding grain, operating bellows, and other mechanical tasks. The castle's influence on architectural development extended far beyond military structures. The techniques developed for castle construction were adapted for use in churches, houses, and other civilian buildings. The pointed arch, the flying buttress, and other architectural innovations that we associate with Gothic architecture were first developed in castle construction and later applied to religious and secular buildings. The castle's legacy extends far beyond the medieval period. These structures established patterns of governance, defense, and social organization that influenced the development of European civilization for centuries. The castle's emphasis on local authority and self-sufficiency provided a model for political organization that persisted long after the feudal system had disappeared. The castle's architectural innovations influenced the development of later building styles, while its military technologies laid the groundwork for the art of warfare that would dominate Europe for generations. The decline of the castle began in the later medieval period, as changes in military technology and political organization made these structures less relevant to the needs of their time.
The development of gunpowder weapons made castle walls less effective as defensive barriers, while the rise of centralized monarchies reduced the importance of local strongholds. Many castles were abandoned or converted to other uses, their military function replaced by more modern forms of defense and administration. The transformation of castles from military strongholds to residential palaces reflected broader changes in medieval society. As central governments became stronger and more effective at maintaining order, the defensive function of castles became less important than their role as symbols of status and centers of cultural life. Many castle lords invested heavily in making their fortresses more comfortable and luxurious, adding large windows, elaborate decorations, and spacious living quarters that would have been unthinkable in earlier, more dangerous times. Yet the castle's influence on the medieval world was profound and lasting. These structures shaped the landscape of Europe for centuries, creating patterns of settlement and land use that are still visible today. The castle's role in the development of feudalism helped to define the social and political structures of medieval society, while its economic activities contributed to the growth of towns and cities throughout Europe. The study of medieval castles provides insights into virtually every aspect of medieval life. These structures were microcosms of medieval society, containing within their walls examples of the technology, art, social organization, economic systems, and cultural values of their time. The archaeological investigation of castle sites continues to yield new information about medieval life, while the surviving documentary evidence provides detailed pictures of how these remarkable communities functioned. The castle represented the medieval world's attempt to create order and stability in a chaotic and dangerous time. These structures were symbols of authority and power, but they were also communities where people lived, worked, and died according to patterns that had been established over generations. The castle was both fortress and home, both symbol and reality, both protection and prison. The human drama that played out within castle walls was as complex and varied as human nature itself. Lords struggled to balance the competing demands of their overlords, their vassals, and their own families. Knights sought honor and glory while trying to survive in a violent world. Peasants worked to feed their families while fulfilling their obligations to their lords. Craftsmen took pride in their skills while competing for patronage and resources. Clergy sought to serve God while navigating the political complexities of their time.
The daily interactions between these different groups created a rich tapestry of medieval life that was both hierarchical and interdependent. The lord might hold ultimate authority, but he depended on his vassals for military service, his peasants for food production, his craftsmen for essential goods and services, and his clergy for spiritual guidance and administrative support. This web of mutual dependence created a stable social system that could endure for generations, even in the face of external threats and internal conflicts. As we conclude our exploration of these remarkable structures, we can appreciate the complexity and sophistication of medieval castle life. These were not simply crude fortifications, but carefully designed systems that balanced the competing demands of defense, governance, and daily life. The castle was a world unto itself, complete with its own economy, society, and culture, yet intimately connected to the broader medieval world of which it was a part. The medieval castle stands as a testament to human ingenuity and determination, a reminder of a time when people created beauty and meaning in the face of constant uncertainty and danger. These structures continue to capture our imagination today, their ruined walls and empty towers speaking to us across the centuries of the people who built them, lived in them,
and ultimately abandoned them to the passage of time. In understanding how medieval castles actually worked, we gain insight not only into the mechanics of medieval life, but also into the enduring human desire to create order, beauty, and meaning in an uncertain world. The castle's story is ultimately a human story, one of communities bound together by mutual dependence and shared purpose. These structures were more than mere buildings. They were the physical manifestation of an entire way of life, a system of values and beliefs that shaped the medieval world and continues to influence our understanding of power, authority, and community today. As we drift toward sleep, we can imagine ourselves walking through those ancient halls, feeling the weight of history in every stone, hearing the echoes of voices that spoke of loyalty, honor, and the endless human struggle to create meaning and security in an uncertain world. The stones of medieval castles have witnessed countless stories of human triumph and tragedy, of love and loss, of hope and despair. Within their walls, children were born and grew to adulthood, couples were married and grew old together, and countless individuals lived out their lives according to the rhythms and patterns of medieval society. The castle was not just a fortress or a symbol of power, but a home where real people faced the universal challenges of human existence. In the quiet of the night, when the last embers of the great hall's fire had died down to glowing coals, the castle would settle into a peaceful stillness broken only by the soft footsteps of guards making their rounds and the distant sound of the night wind moving through the battlements. It is in this peaceful silence that we can best appreciate the enduring legacy of these remarkable structures and the people who called them home. The medieval castle, in all its complexity and grandeur, remains one of humanity's most impressive achievements, a lasting monument to the ingenuity, determination, and dreams of those who came before us.